Greetings, class. This is Mr. Clemmons here to talk about civil rights. And since we were out with the snow day on one of our days, we lost like 90 minutes of class time. So I'm putting together a video for you guys starting at 1963 when Betty Freidan publishes The Feminine Mystique, and I'll go as far as I can in about 10 minutes. And that should help put us further along in our civil rights discussion. I don't like doing this way, but it's just what it is, Okay? So, 1963, Betty Freidan publishes The Feminine Mystique, which argued that sexism is a pervasive form of discrimination in which women were victimized by false values that kept them from gaining access to the equal roles in society. And basically what this does is it's like dropping an atomic bomb on relationships between men and women, because women really have lived as second-class citizens for a very, very long time. And they also want to do more than just be stay-at-home moms. Nothing wrong with being a stay-at-home mom, but there are many that want to do that, and they want to do more things. And so the thing about it is that the reason it causes trouble between men and women is that the men have no clue that the women aren't perfectly happy taking care of them and taking care of their kids' dirty diapers, and washing their underwear and all that other kind of stuff too, and that they want more. So that causes lots and lots of conversations during that time period. Then in April of 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. returns to Birmingham, Alabama to lead a march to desegregate the city. Dr. King and other protesters were arrested and put in jail. Over the next 3 weeks, hundreds of others marched, including children, where Police Commissioner Bull Connor turned water hoses and police dogs on the kids, and most of the marches were put on national television. This turned many Americans against the Southern whites who wanted to keep the South segregated. During his time in jail, Dr. King wrote what has become called his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, one of the most beautiful pieces of what today is called liberation theology. In the letter, he challenges the white moderates to step forward and speak out against discrimination. Now, August 28, 1963, by the way, I might add, the 8th anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till, the largest civil rights march in American history took place at Washington, D.C., past the White House and Capitol to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. More than 250,000 people, including 75,000 whites, made the march. A number of singers sang, writers spoke, but it was Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech that thrilled the crowd. One of the great moments and one of the great speeches in all of American history. In that speech, Dr. King says that he has come, that the American Negro, the African Americans, have come to cash a check. And in the past, that check has come back insufficient funds. And what they're saying is that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is a promissory note. And we've been promised that we're going to have our rights, and we've not had those rights. And so we expect to get those. And so that's what he challenges America with at that time. In 1964, partly in response to the March on Washington, Congress passed and President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act banned most discrimination in employment and public housing. Secondly, it enlarged the federal power to speed up school desegregation. Lastly, it established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to ensure fair treatment in employment. And that goes for everybody. In 1964, 24th Amendment to the Constitution abolished the poll tax, the tax paid to vote. So another barrier to African Americans being able to vote is knocked out of the way. In 1964, in June, 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi. 2 of them are white and 1 is black. They had been a part of the Freedom Summer, where thousands of volunteers came to the South to help register voters in Mississippi. This included nearly 1,000 white college students from the North. During this summer, 37 churches were bombed or burned to the ground. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, was founded in response to black people being banned from state Democratic Party. They wanted to represent the state of Mississippi in the Democratic National Convention. However, they were not seated as requested, but gained public attention. For example, this was led by a woman named Fannie Lou Hamer at the time. In 1964, Malcolm X had become the most powerful leader and speaker for the Black Power movement that felt that black people should take up arms and defend themselves from the violence whites were directing toward blacks. His speeches strike fear in many white Americans. Malcolm X disagrees with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent approach to protest. One of the things that scares a lot of white people is basically Malcolm X says, get your guns, defend yourselves, if necessary, kill whitey. And what happens is that, and I know he didn't intend for this to happen, what happens is there are a lot of white people that are worried by this, and they decide to come over to Dr. King's side. All of a sudden, they're like, oh, we shall overcome, Dr. King. How can we help? Because they would rather have a nonviolent protest to work with than a violent race war. And so actually, Malcolm X pushes a lot of moderate whites over into Dr. King's camp to help push for more civil rights. In 1965, between 600 and 2,000 protesters participated in 2 blocked protest marches for voter registration from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. For example, 600 marchers were attacked by state troopers with tear gas and clubs. Bloody Sunday was shown on national television. This led to a second and then a third march that began with 3,000 people and swelled up to 25,000 people by the time it reached Montgomery and the state capitol. And that's going to be the push for the next piece of legislation for civil rights. In 1965, 10 weeks after the march, Congress passed and President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965, eliminating literacy tests in voting and enabling federal examiners to register voters. That took it out of the local county courthouses' hands to register voters. The percentage of black citizens registered to vote grew from 20% in 1960 to 62% in 1971. Wow, when registering to vote becomes fair, African Americans are able to register to vote. 1964-1965, after a trip to Mecca and a shift in thinking, Malcolm X breaks with the spiritual leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, and moves more toward a moderate position close to Dr. King. He visits Mecca, and what he finds there is that he sees how the black Muslims in America have warped the true vision of what Islam is supposed to be, and he realizes that Islam is a religion of peace, not a religion of war, and so he changes his positions. He still comes back, he's still an angry black man in this time period and stuff, but he's not necessarily saying, get your guns, kill Whitey anymore. And Elijah Muhammad and other leaders didn't like that in the black Muslim movement, and so he is murdered. 1965, Malcolm X is murdered. His autobiography of Malcolm X is a very powerful statement of the anger black Americans felt in the 1950s and 1960s, and it continues to be one of the most read autobiographies in American history. 1965, 70% of Stanford women graduates state in a survey that they planned not to work when their children were preschool age. Now, that's just 2 years after Betty Friedan's book has come out. So 7 out of 10 women at some of the top colleges in the United States, Stanford being one of the top, say that they're going to stay home when their kids are born. Now, you fast forward to 1972, and only 7% of Stanford women graduates say that they're going to stay home when their children are very small. And so you can see over the course of time between 1963 and 1972 the change in attitudes of young women about being stay-at-home moms and things like that at our top colleges and universities. In 1966, the Black Panther movement, a political movement, was founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale to fight police brutality, particularly in the ghetto. They opposed the Vietnam War and supported Third World revolutionary movements. It spread from California to other urban areas. Community projects were overshadowed by their support of armed self-defense, and the FBI used counterintelligence to disrupt party activities. Black Power. CORE and SNCC activists led by Stokely Carmichael called for black self-reliance under the banner of Black Power. They advocated black-owned and operated institutions and businesses and called for increased political and economic power in communities, and activists focused on poverty and social justice issues in urban areas. Others worked to end police harassment. The attention to racial pride led some African Americans to reject white society in favor of African clothing and hairstyles. In 1966, partly as a result of the success by African Americans, the National Organization for Women is founded to push for equal rights and opportunities for women. In the summers of 1966 and 1967, race riots break out in major cities across the country, particularly in northern cities, mostly over the economic inequalities between blacks and whites. This surprises many Americans who thought only racial problems were in the South. The Young Lords. Puerto Ricans in New York City formed the Young Lords Organization, YLO, sought self-determination for Puerto Ricans in the U.S. and in the Caribbean, desired to improve neighborhood conditions, advocated improved access to health care. The new urban politics. Many black people were inspired by Black Power to work within the political system. There were elections in 1967 and mayors in Cleveland, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana. By 1972, the National Black Political Convention met in Gary to discuss the formation of a third political party rather than continue support for the Democratic Party. Instead, the convention created the National Black Political Agenda, which advocated national health insurance, community control of schools in black neighborhoods, and elimination of the death penalty. In 1968, in April 1968, Dr. King came to Memphis, Tennessee to help in a protest to gain more rights from sanitation workers. On the night of April 3rd, Dr. King made his now famous mountaintop speech at a church in Memphis prior to the march set for the next day. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was murdered at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. In reaction to Dr. King's death, race riots and violence broke out in cities all over America. One of the tragic things about this is that Dr. King had been holding the nonviolent movement together, and now he's been violently, brutally gunned down in Memphis at a hotel. And so the lid was blown off everything, and violence reigned everywhere during that time period. In 1968, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Congress passed this act shortly after Dr. King's murder. It prohibited discrimination in the sale or rental of most housing. Secondly, it made it a federal crime to harm civil rights workers. Now, what difference does that make? You might be thinking, Mr. Clemmons, that's murder, so wouldn't that be illegal? Yes, of course, murder is illegal. However, in the South, since the Civil War, only a handful of white people had ever been convicted of murdering a black person. And so it made it a federal crime to do that so that you'd have federal judges and federal juries, and you wouldn't have all white juries just letting people off like they did in most southern states in that era, too. We'll go ahead and stop there at that point, and we'll pick up and wrap things up next time. Take care.